Have you ever been alone in a dark forest? I'm not talking about a daytime hike. I mean, completely alone. No cell signal. No one around. Just you and the forest. If you're listening to this alone, maybe you should reconsider. Some people swear the forest watches, that it knows when you're there. And if you don't respect it, it might show you things no one should ever see. These stories are real. Or at least that's what those who survived swear they saw and felt. Tonight, you will hear about disturbing forest encounters. Stories of people who saw something that shouldn't be there. Creatures that mimic human voices, footprints appearing out of nowhere, and shadows moving between the trees. If it were just one isolated case, we could call it hallucination, a trick of the mind. But then why are there so many similar reports? Why do different people from different parts of the world claim to have seen the same thing? The first story happened to a man who decided to go camping alone, in a place where he was never supposed to be. He was experienced. He knew how to set up a tent, light a fire, and find a good spot to spend the night. But that night, something felt different. At first, he thought it was just an animal. But then came the whispers, low, drawn out, as if something or someone was trying to say something. He held his breath and tried to listen more closely. The voices seemed to be circling his tent, but they weren't normal. They spoke in a language he didn't recognize. When he finally gathered the courage to open the tent and shine his light outside, everything was silent. No sounds, no animals, just the wind. But when he looked down at the ground, he saw footprints around his tent. Footprints that weren't there before. The forest was dense, suffocating. The trees stood like sleeping giants, their twisted branches intertwining above, blocking almost all moonlight. Only small gaps allowed a faint, pale glow to seep through, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The silence wasn't absolute, and that was the problem. The man realized something strange was missing. No crickets, no owls hooting, no small animals scurrying through the underbrush. Just the wind and a low, distant sound. A murmur. He looked at the fire in front of him, flickering weakly, casting shifting shadows all around. The comforting warmth of the flames contrasted with the icy sensation creeping down his spine. He felt watched. He blinked a few times, trying to shake off the unease. It was just his imagination. It had to be. But then, that sound came again. His muscles tensed. He held his breath, trying to listen more closely. The sound seemed to come from everywhere. It was as if the forest itself was speaking. He turned his head, scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing. No movement. No reflection of eyes catching the firelight. But the feeling was still there. His heart pounded. He grabbed the flashlight next to his sleeping bag and flicked it on, aiming toward the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees, moss-covered trunks, nothing else. But when he lowered the flashlight, he saw it. Footprints. Fresh. Around his tent. And the worst part, they weren't his. Slow and uneven. The footprints around his tent, they weren't his. But that wasn't the worst part. They weren't normal. They were human, but wrong. The spacing between them was inconsistent, as if whoever, or whatever, made them had been staggering. Some prints were too deep, as if they had been made with inhuman force, while others barely pressed into the earth, as if the thing had been floating. Then he noticed something else. The footprints, they didn't just circle his tent. They led into the forest, a clear trail. And at the very edge of his fire's light, he saw it. A figure. It stood just beyond the reach of his flashlight, motionless. Its outline was vague, blending with the trees, like a shadow pretending to be something more. But the worst part was its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where its face should have been, there was only darkness, a void, a hollow absence that made his stomach twist. His mind screamed at him to run, to move, to do something, but his body was frozen, because the moment he saw it, whispered, his flashlight flickered, his heart pounded against his ribs. He could feel it, not see but feel, the thing moving closer, not with footsteps, not with any sound at all, just the air shifting, the temperature dropping, and the overwhelming, suffocating sense of presence. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. No movement, no sound, just nothing. He turned his flashlight back toward the footprints. They had changed. Before, they had led away from his tent. Now, they led straight back to him. His pulse pounded in his ears. The footprints, they had changed. They led back to him. But that wasn't possible. He had just seen them pointing in the other direction. He took a step back. The fire flickered weakly, like it was struggling to stay alive. He swept his flashlight across the trees, his breath fogging in the icy air. No footprints, no figure, no trace that anything had been there at all. Had he imagined it? The footprints? The whispers? The thing? No, this was real. Had to be real. He wasn't. He spun around, his stomach twisting into knots. His tent was open, but he hadn't touched it. Inside, everything was the same, except his journal. It was lying outside, but that wasn't what made his blood run cold. It was the handwriting inside. It wasn't his. Shaking, he bent down, fingers brushing the pages. His notes, his sketches, everything was there. But at the bottom of the last page, a message. Don't look at it. He felt it. He didn't see it. He didn't hear it. But he felt it. Something was there. Close. Too close. His eyes darted through the darkness. His flashlight shook in his grip, the beam flickering. Nothing. But something was watching him. He knew it. He swallowed hard, reached for the notebook. But as his fingers brushed the paper, the page turned on its own. Another message, scratched into the page with desperate force. It's not outside anymore. His instinct screamed. He turned to run, but froze. A shadow loomed over him, and for the first time he felt it touch his skin. Ice cold, like something was breathing inside him. Darkness. The silence was wrong. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. It was thick, heavy, like something was pressing against his ears, muffling the world around him. His breath was shallow. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The air felt denser, colder, wrapping around his skin like something unseen was tightening its grip. He clenched his jaw. His fingers dug into his palms. He couldn't turn around. He wouldn't. His heartbeat pounded in his skull. His flashlight flickered, its weak glow barely piercing the darkness. He forced himself to take a breath, but the air burned in his throat as if the very act of breathing was wrong, unnatural. Then something shifted in his peripheral vision. A shape, a shadow, stretching, moving where no movement should exist. He flinched. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. He knew, deep in the pit of his stomach, he wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to have seen that message. He wasn't supposed to know. He wasn't alone. The truth was never meant to be found. He realized that too late. His knees buckled. The pages of the notebook trembled in his grip. He forced himself to read, to understand. But the words twisted, shifting under his gaze as if they were never meant for human eyes. They were warnings. From others. From before. If you hear it, hears you. If you see it, sees you. If you read this, it's already too late. He turned. And then, nothing. A different camper finds an abandoned tent. A half-burned notebook, pages torn. One page still intact. Don't look at it. You made it to the end, but some things should never be heard alone. If you're still here, if you're still listening, then maybe it's already too late. But don't worry, there are more stories waiting for you. Darker ones. Deeper ones. Subscribe before the next one finds you first.